Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Ukraine Update from M Compass Media. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Every week I'm joined by John Moran, former head of the foreign desk for the Irish Press. John gives us an update of what's happened over the last week in Ukraine and his predictions for the coming week. Thanks for joining us, John.
All right, Finbar.
What have you got for us today?
This week we have the war in Ukraine, April the 5th, 2023. On the front lines in Bakhmut. Western countries are counting on a last chance saloon offensive by the Ukrainian army in Donbass to put a halt to recent Russian military successes, which are grinding down the huge Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut and raising the question of whether or not Ukraine will be able to mount an offensive at all. Ukraine has up to 60,000 troops massed in and around the general area of Bakhmut. These could be used to relieve the Bakhmut garrison or for the long-awaited offensive in the Zaporizhia front line, aiming to punch a route to the Azov Sea, split the Russian forces, and launch attacks on Crimea. We are rapidly approaching the period where the outcome of the war will be decided one way or the other. Already in Chernihiv, British Challenger tanks have been spotted. The more we see of these recently arrived military hardware and ordnance, the sooner the Ukrainian offensive will begin. While the South Zaporizhia front is very heavily defended, the Northern front is, by comparison, very lightly defended. Dima, from Military Summary Channel, is puzzled why this is so. He concludes that the reason for this light defense may be that the Russians want the Ukrainians to attack in that direction because they've organized a surprise for them when a large number of Ukrainians pour into the bulge created by the offensive. None of which is to say that the Ukrainian offensive could take place elsewhere, perhaps further along the northern front in the Lugansk area. With rain forecasts until next week, it is unlikely the Ukrainian military leadership will begin any offensive until the ground conditions improve. However, it is possible to launch an offensive on Bakhmut using the roads. This will be far more difficult as the roads can easily be targeted by Russian forces. In Bakhmut, the Wagner battalion are claiming technical victory after capturing the main administrative building in the city center. It's a highly technical claim, however, as fierce fighting rages on the streets of the city from all sides as Wagner tries to capture Bakhmut before the Ukrainian offensive can begin. Wagner are now aided by large numbers of regular Russian troops flooding into the city to take the city as soon as possible. Wagner forces are advancing steadily from the east, where Ukraine appears to be abandoning the city, up to the railway line that splits the city between east and west. On the western side of the city, Ukrainian forces are very heavily dug in a district that contains many easily defended high-rise structures solidly built during the Soviet era. What to look out for? My take is China will make a dramatic entrance into the Iran conflict, which may help end it. Donbass blogger targeted. An explosion in the St. Petersburg cafe has killed a well-known Donbass blogger, Vladlen Tatarsky, who was on a visit to the city to give a talk on war reporting. While there, he was presented with a statuette as an award for his work. However, shortly after he received it, it blew up. He died, and up to 10 people were seriously injured. This high-profile killing is reminiscent of the killing of the academic and journalist Darina Dugina, whose car blew up as she returned from an event near Moscow. Ukrainian terrorists are believed to be behind these killings. In Donbass, attacks on journalists are a regular feature of daily life. Hotels where reporters stay are regularly targeted. At the start of the Russian evacuation from Kherson, Some months ago, a team from the local TV station were targeted as they waited for the evacuees. The EU has a policy of not covering events in Donbass. Journalists who have gone there have even been sanctioned. EU bosses still don't want the truth about Donbass to be known. Meanwhile, all roads are leading to Beijing. China's astonishing arrival on the world political scene, one, embracing President Putin, and two, curating a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which may have started to unlock many of the intense conflicts in the region over the past 20 years. Syria has been welcomed back to the Arab League soon, and Syria has also had talks with the Egyptian government, again, opening up areas for cooperation. Look in astonishment as President Macron of France and EC President Ursula von der Leyen from Germany are today being received by the Chinese leadership in Beijing. It is very interesting to see all the Europeans rushing off to China instead of Washington to ensure they don't lose out in their affairs with this economic behemoth, a new world leader. What the pair will find to their shock is the days of gunboat diplomacy and European control of the global south are finally over. I can't wait to hear the written accounts of both sides in this historic moment. Action. Ireland should immediately request a high-level meeting with the Chinese leadership. It's in Ireland's interest. P.S. Anybody but Leo. Meanwhile, the ruble will be rubble, US President Joe Biden said at the beginning of the conflict, a quote which he now is embarrassed by. One of the biggest issues exploding onto the consciousness of the world leaders right now is the primacy of the dollar. The iconic US currency is rapidly losing its premier status as 90% of the world is outside of the US and NATO countries, and trade is now being made in local currencies. The impetus for this change was the freezing of Russian funds in Western banks following its special military operation. Other countries will not want to find themselves in the same position if subject to US or NATO sanctions. French financial advisor René Giraud said a step in transforming the dollar into a weapon was the freezing of the Russian dollar reserves by the central bank. India, China, and Russia now all trade outside of the dollar. India, since April the 1st, it is now carrying out business and trade in rupees with 18 countries in the region. Malaysia is one of these countries that have agreed to trade with India in rupees. The BRICS countries are now trade in each other's currencies, and soon they will have their own agreed currency. Petro giant Saudi Arabia has now begun the process of joining the BRICS. This has enormous implications for the dollar, as it was tied to Saudi oil wealth to make it the world's reserve currency. Losing this status, together with its mountain of debt, will prove a very difficult issue for the US to resolve. Meanwhile, OPEC and Russia have agreed to cut oil production, which will now raise the price of oil on the world markets. Unholy row in Kiev monastery. The standoff at the Petreshka Lavra cave monastery is still not resolved. All week there have been confrontations between the Orthodox congregation and supporters of President Zelensky, who want all Orthodox monks out of the monastery. Court moves have failed to resolve the matter. An extraordinary image has emerged from the monastery of a brave, eloquent 11-year-old girl being confronted by far-right protesters, but she was more than able to hold her own against them. She gets my Person of the Week award. And finally, on Planet Bizarro, some shorts. Washington Post reports that the EU meetings these days, the guiding principle is don't mention the war, or more specifically, don't mention Nord Stream. Neither EU countries nor EU officials want to mention the Nord Stream affair. They don't even want to know who carried out this act of international terrorism in the heart of Europe. The Washington Post wants to see Nord Stream as a European issue rather than an American one. P.S. My take, it was the US, the UK, and Norway. Finland has finally joined NATO after Turkey withdrew its objections, so now 22 of the 28 EU members will also be members of NATO. Today, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg announced all NATO countries will contribute 500 million each annually towards the rebuilding and upkeep of Ukraine. The contributions will be for an indefinite duration as well. Unfortunately for Finnish Prime Minister, who led Finland into NATO, she lost out in elections and is no longer PM. No doubt, however, as member of the WEF, Sanna Marin will be looked after. And finally, US Vice President Kamala Harris received a scolding on her trip to Africa over the US history of stealing its resources and killing its leaders. Ms. Harris is visiting Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia during her trip. Earlier in Moscow, President Putin wrote off some 20 billion in debt to Africa after talks with African leaders.
There's a lot to unpack in that there, John. Let's get stuck in with it straight away, where you began with the battle scenes and what's happening in Bakhmut. I don't know if we should call it Bakhmut anymore or whether we should call it Artyomovsk, because 85% of it, I believe now, is under Russian control. And I noticed some commentators who have been calling it Bakhmut have started to call it Artyomovsk now. So I don't know what the protocol is there.
I think it probably would be wise until after it's finally taken before making a decision on that.
Yeah. So we'll stick with Bakhmut and Artyomovsk for now.
Yeah, we don't only confuse our people, you know.
Yeah. And we have videos here from Bakhmut and the fighting. It shows the devastation. It shows the conditions that the Ukrainian soldiers are surviving under and quite often not surviving under. We'll have a look at these videos. We'll come back in 1 minute.
Your butt. Your
John, there are videos that are like the last video shows missiles coming in and just missing guys by a couple of feet. It must impact their nerves and their morale so much.
Well, not only that, I mean, you're dealing with a different quality of soldier now. They've lost there have been estimates now that they're down to their third army. They've lost 2 armies already. The first one, which was all their best trained men, they've lost all them. And the second army, they've lost most of them as well. And they had been fitted up with people dragged in off the streets of Ukraine who don't want to be there at all. And indeed, Western reports are coming in that the morale of the Ukrainian troops for the first time is sinking, and that is particularly bad in Bakhmut. That is a new thing, because if morale begins to slip, it's over.
I suppose you can lie to them when they're well behind the front lines, but when you bring them to the front lines and they see the reality, there's no fooling people. And the news has to move backwards towards Kiev eventually. There has to be some people going home and telling the truth about what's going on. So the penny has to be dropping. We have video footage here, John. There was reports of, and there was in fact an international criminal court arrest warrant issued for President Putin, and also the Russian Minister for Human Rights of Children. And it was issued on the basis that the Russians were kidnapping Ukrainian children and bringing them into Russia, when in reality these children were actually being sent off by their parents to places of safety in Russia. They were Russian speaking and Russian cultured people. But we have a video here, and it's one of a number of videos purporting to be, now we're not there so we can't prove 100%, but purporting to be a mother who's explaining what happened in Bakhmut when a number of different Ukrainian army units would regularly call, trying to get people to evacuate into Ukraine. And the people who didn't want to leave, they would take their children, which forced them then to leave as well, to go to Ukraine rather than to stay or go to Russian sides. So these are people who are Russian speaking, Russian cultured people who have an affinity with Russia. And in one way or another, they were being forced to go towards Ukraine to seek safety rather than towards the Russian side. We'll have a look at this video and we'll come back in a little minute.
Родители были вынуждены ехать на территорию Украины, даже если они того не хотели. Потом через время началась принудительная эвакуация детей службами «Белый ангел» и «Феникс». Это были машины, это были военные ребята, которые в полное обмундирование ездили по адресам, ездили по подвалам, искали детей и принудительно, именно силой вывозили детей. Если родители соглашались ехать, могли вместе с ними. Если родители были против, забирали детей. Поэтому был у нас период, когда мы своих детей просто прятали. Прятали по холодным квартирам, прятали по другим адресам, по другим подвалам, то есть не там, где они зарегистрированы или их видели ранее. И поэтому у нас, грубо говоря, наверное, 2,5 недели, если не около 3 недель, был вот такой вот, мы прятали. У меня лично прятали тоже девочку 4 лет. Она знала, что это такое «Феникс», что прятаться, когда ей говорили там «тихо», она как мышка сидела. По очереди выглядывали постоянно в окна, чтобы увидеть эти машины. Если машина подъезжает во двор или где-то начинает мелькать, девочек взрослые быстро брали, уходили на другие этажи, от которых были ключи, в холодные квартиры, закрывались и сидели как мышки, пока машины не уедут. Потом возвращались в теплую квартиру, отогревались.
So that's a video of a mother explaining how for about 3 weeks, as the Russians were approaching Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces or units were coming and taking their children if they refused to go, so that they would have to follow. What do you make about that, John?
Well, it fits in with the whole picture of Ukraine. From the beginning, there was an effort made to divide and conquer the Ukrainians from the Russian speakers. And the British and the Americans were up to their necks in that. It was a horrible thing that they did. But now it is rampant everywhere in Ukraine. For example, you will find that in many, many areas, the Russian speakers will say that they are the ones being chosen to fight for Ukraine against other Russian speakers. So it's not just in the area of not allowing people to evacuate to where they want to go or any of that. All of this is based on a hatred of Russia and any of their interests. And these are just expressions of this particular hatred.
Yeah, another expression of that hatred that we have been following and showcasing on the show is the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. We have a couple of videos coming up now. We like to keep people updated with what's happening. The first video we can't timestamp. We don't know when this video was made, but it shows what is described as vigilantes using tear gas to empty out an Orthodox church so that it can be taken over by others. And the brethren and the monks and the priests are forced out by tear gas. And the description that came along with this video suggested that the Ukrainian police and National Guard were standing by whilst this was happening. And this seems to fit in with the MO that we've seen over many, many videos coming out over the last few weeks. The second video we're going to show is that little girl that John referred to earlier, who stood up to a Ukrainian nationalist, that was at a Orthodox church with the intentions of shutting that Orthodox church down. We'll have a look at these two videos and we'll come back to you in a wee minute.
Я хочу бути в Українській православній церкві. Блаженнішому внутрі. Даша. Я сама, моя душа кричить, я не можу вже терпіти це. 11.
11 років. Ти на 11 років знаєш, що душа кричить, що ти можеш чи ні. Хто? Покажи мені пальцем, хто.
На відміну від вас, я сама.
Ми ж тут просто...
Мені не потрібно ніхто.
Дивись, ви ж не запитуєте, що потрібно. Все добре. Ніхто не сміє образу. Все добре. Ну чому ти тут стоїш, скажи? От скільки годин ти тут стоїш маленький?
Я захищаю свою віру, свою церкву.
Скільки ти тут стоїш, скажи, будь ласка.
Скільки потрібно, стільки я і стою, скільки Богу волю.
Так що ж, заучне, приведи свою дівчину, щоб вона знала вірою українською. Приведи свого сина, приведи, щоб вірою українською. Заспівай.
So there's two videos. The second video is of that little girl who is standing up for her religion, for her church, and for her community, I guess. John, you raised that earlier, that little girl. Would you like to elaborate on it a little bit?
I was so impressed with that little girl, 11 years of age, and no fear. She was telling what she believed to be the absolute truth, and nothing was going to stand in her way. And she was polite. She wasn't ever in any way aggressive or unpleasant. She reminded me of a politer version of Greta Thunberg, who was dealing with a really difficult issue, as brave as they come. She's a marvelous little girl. And that's a wonderful image that I think captures that whole awfulness of what's happening to those monks in the monastery caves.
And isn't it, when you consider, well, we're saying brave, and I'm not sure if the viewers fully get what we mean. That little girl and her family and their community live in a country at the moment that is run essentially by far-right nationalists who run the communities and use terror to dominate communities. And for them to stand up like that is a very brave thing. I'm not sure what the outcome of that will be for her family. If we do hear any more news on that, we will let you know. John, you also raised the issue of the bomb in St. Petersburg cafe come bookshop a couple of days ago that killed a famous blogger and war journalist called Vladlen Tatarsky. Do you want to give us a little bit more detail? Well, I'll tell you what, we'll look at the video first of the actual bombing. There's no cuts or gore, don't worry about that, folks. There's just a flash at the end of this video, and that's it, over. There was only one person killed. The bomber survived. She has been interrogated by Russian police. We might have a chat about that after we watch this video.
Okay.
Последует и политический кризис. Вот скажите, пожалуйста, Настя, иди сюда садись. Садись сюда. Или вот сюда, куда ты хочешь. Давай в кресло садись. Да. Ух ты! Какой-то красивый парень. Это что, нет? Давай, ладно. Вот. Просто, золотой. Рабочая история. Да, все, золотой ладный. Отлично. Ну, ты знаешь, слава богу, я гораздо красивее. Да, ну тут просто кубики.
So that was the cafe bookshop bombing that killed the Russian blogger and war journalist Vladlen Tatarsky a few days ago. John, it's an attack on a journalist, but it's not the first time that Ukrainian elements or agents have done things like this since the start of this war.
No, it's not. I mean, a lot of effort went into killing him. It was a tricky business. I watched the girl coming in, and I was watching her behavior, and she gave him the statuette, And then he said to her, sit down here in a seat that wasn't too far from her. And she was reluctant to sit down. And you can think in your mind, if she knows there's a bomb in that, she wants to get out of there. But she didn't. She was about, I'd say, 15 feet from the bomb. But she was injured slightly, but not very much. Now, the killing of journalists, unfortunately, if you go back to Dara Dugina in Moscow when her car was blown up as she came back from an event, another top journalist and an academic as well, she was, a great loss, two great losses. But again, if you go to Donbass, which the world doesn't want to know about, but if you go there, if you see what's going on there, and you see that any town that's near the front line, its hotel will be attacked because they know that's where the journalists will be. They did another one in Kherson where a local TV crew came along to film the evacuation of Kherson at the time the Russians were leaving it. And they were hit with an explosion. And not only that, they were hit a second time, a double tap. A few of them were killed. So there's nothing new about this. They don't like the people who want to give out information that's true. This is a feature of modern life. It's not just there, it's universal. Look at Julian Assange being murdered in public slowly for telling the truth about war. This is where we are. We have to get out of this bad dream that we're in and get back to a more civilized way of behaving.
And isn't there a hypocrisy amongst journalists that certain journalists, when they're killed, the journalist world, if you want to put it that way, will come out and just print story after story about it. 20 years later, that journalist will be annually still remembered in all of the papers, all of the media. But here we have journalists being killed by Ukrainian elements and forces, and if any word at all comes out about it, it's at a minimum praising the person that's been taken out and minimizing their work. But in Russia, they're war journalists, and they were very, very popular. And aiming for journalists is really the lowest of the low. But it's not something, if I'm going to be straight about it, that I'm surprised to see within Ukraine itself. There have been purges of the press, there have been purges of political parties. There's no real opposition party in Ukraine anymore. All press have to go through a government department now. So the idea that they'd want to go outside of their own borders to shut people up doesn't surprise me at all, though it does disappoint me. John,
it's like having a spoiled child who is allowed to do what it likes because the father allows it, America being the father, and it thinks it can do what it likes while the Americans are with them. That's the unfortunate situation.
That's exactly what's happening. I did come across reports on this before, but not the detail of a number of so-called battalions that were operating, one called Tornado in particular.
Tornado, yes.
Yeah, and that there was court cases held in Ukraine in relation to this battalion. And that the evidence that was produced and was accepted by the court was that this Tornado group, which was being armed and financed essentially by the West, by NATO countries, and particularly the United States, they were infamous for their cruelty and their torture. And that the leader of this group and other members of the group filmed themselves torturing women, men, raping men, and the phrase used in the court was raping men to death, where they actually killed men in the process and filmed themselves doing it. And these were the people that were being sent out to torment the people of Donbass on our behalf, on the behalf of the United States, and let's be straight about it, on behalf of the EU. And so all of this kind of stuff is coming out. Have you come across this Tornado battalion?
I have, yeah. They're absolutely notorious. I mean, a lot of these people come from football hooligans for various football teams, ultras. And, they have that attitude of inflict pain on your enemy and all of that kind of thing. That's the way they think. It's a life of intimidation, viciousness, cruelty, and they enjoy that because they do well in that kind of an environment because they're so brutal. So it's the only chance they'll get to, quote, achieve, unquote, anything in life. And they're given a free rein to do it. Now, to be fair to Ukraine, they did take these people to court and they were dealt with. But they were released very quickly as soon as the special military operation began.
Just on that subject, John, of where some of these people are coming from. The United States has just put up, the Ukrainian government have put out advertisements in the United States looking for people to join the Ukrainian army and to go to the front line, essentially. And we'll just look at this advertisement now because it's worrying. Let's have a look at this. So here's the advertisement, and they're aiming to people who are not doing well, people who are on social welfare. Join the International Legion for the Defense of Ukraine. International volunteer status, medical insurance, monthly payments. And it shows what appears to be a homeless person, maybe on a subway, something like that, sleeping on the seat in the subway. And you can see the logo there of the Department of Defense of Ukraine. So this is where they're at the moment. They're trying to get homeless people to join in the United States, to join up to fight in Ukraine, to be cannon fodder, to die for something that they'll have no clue about, but they'll get medical insurance. Well, they're going, by God, they're going to need that medical insurance if they go to Ukraine. Have you come across this, John?
Well, my main problem with that is that if the United States and Ukraine think that the solution to the problem in Ukraine is more war, I have a question for them. How do you think it's going to end if you continue with that view? Because it'll end in a very, very nasty situation, and it will involve nuclear weapons. And before that, it will involve World War III, which will involve us all. That's the big fear that I have. And not only that, there has been some talk in the EU about EU countries sending peacekeeping troops to Western Ukraine. Now, this to me sounds like, oh, we'll hold the west of Ukraine. Poland is very interested in the west of Ukraine. There was a meeting between the Polish leader, Duda, and Zelensky today, and they're talking about unifying both countries, leaving out the border. Now, this sounds to me like Poland getting what they want, because at the end of this, if there's anything at all left of Ukraine, it will be that bit on the west.
Who's going to stand up? Who's going to stand up against that in Ukraine now? All their young men are dead. All their people, anybody who's got energy, got up and left. Who's going to stop that now? And Zelensky has no commitment to Ukraine or anything except his own bank balance and ego, as far as I can see. So who in Ukraine will stand up and say, no, we are Ukraine still. We may be now West Ukraine, but we're Ukraine. That just, to me, it's a country now that's open to be abused even more than we thought. It just going back to that.
My hope on that is that the Ukrainians, if you see now, the guys on the front line are grumbling. The people at home are grumbling. They try to stop people being dragged off the streets. So what I suspect could be coming is a realization of what the reality of their situation is, and that to continue along the lines decided by the United States and NATO will destroy Ukraine completely. It may not even exist.
John, we have video here that addresses what you were saying earlier about the extreme violence and the pressure that people are under in the war zone itself on a minute-to-minute basis. And yet our corporate media seem to be romanticizing this war and talking about what are impossible feats being committed and heroes left, right, and center. But the reality is very, very different, and we're not being shown that. So We're going to step beyond the pale here, and we're going to actually show some horrific video footage of the reality of this war, of absolute destruction, of dead bodies, mainly Ukrainian soldiers, lying scattered all over the battlefield. This is the reality of war. If you have a particularly sensitive nature, maybe you should look away from this. But we are encouraging people who have been just inundated with corporate media tales of romanticism and tales of impossible feats and things like that. We're encouraging it to maybe de-engineer your mind from that by watching these videos. We'll be back to you in a wee minute. Horrific images coming from the battlefields in Ukraine. We're not showing that for any gruesome reason. We don't find it in any way entertaining. It's about revealing the truth about what war is really like and has always been like since the beginning of time. We've always had warmongers, and we've always had people to romanticize war. John, what's your take on all those images and video footage?
Yeah, they're horrendous. I find that, you know, after a certain while, I just don't look at them anymore. You know, if there's something comes up that has a particular resonance, you know, you look at it, but it's very, very hard to look at those things. I dread to think what those poor guys must be feeling like. Because think when you see the guys who are mangled and torn apart grotesquely, which is what munitions do, they make a terrible mess of a human being. And you have these guys then who see all this. What are they going to be like when they go home? Because the problem will be, like always, you know, God and the soldier all men adore in times of trouble and no more. For when war is over and all things righted, God is neglected and the old soldier slighted. That's unfortunately the reality of the post-war situation. I would really love it if some people who are so enthusiastic about all of this, I'd love it if they retained their interest in those soldiers and in those victims when this ends, which it will do. And sooner than people might think, I would say, now that President Xi is involved. But it's a horrendous affair. When you have the kind of weapons that they have, you're not safe in a trench. They can have shock weapons that explode above it and they'll kill everything below it. They have the huge toss flamethrowers that cover a vast area in fire. There's no way you can survive it. Or if you manage to escape it, your burns would be so bad that you'd be disfigured for life. I mean, these are meant to do these things to human beings. The last thing we should want to do is to take them out and get them going. But unfortunately, there are some people who seem to think that, you know, oh, yes, wouldn't it be nice if we had all these fantastic weapons and all the rest of it? Unfortunately, the people who make these weapons like conflict because they can sell these weapons in conflicts. And it's a bit of a vicious circle and it needs to be broken.
It is horrific. Talking about weapons, John, we have a video graphic here of the latest in terms of the material losses from the Ukrainian side, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. We'll just play this, and it's again every week these numbers rise as there's more and more losses. These are materials that have been sent over from Western countries, from the United States, from EU countries, NATO countries, from Australia, different places, and this is just being destroyed as well. There's no point to it. Loss of life, loss of materials, hundreds of billions of euros worth of weaponry that could have been financing something far more worthwhile around the world. And instead, what we have is loss of 250,000 men on the Ukrainian side and hundreds of billions of euros worth of arms. We'll just have a look at this and we'll come back. John, just more material losses on the Ukrainian side, just waste everywhere, from waste of life, waste of money. You said earlier you think that it may be coming to a close because of the meeting with Z. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, if I think by now people may have seen the effect she has because of the enormous industrial wealth that it has and the power it has. It's all over the world. I mean, it's the biggest partners in so many countries. It's the new coming thing, and the rest of the world is seeing that, and they're deserting the dollar like in droves. I mean, I was looking this morning, there was a deal between Brazil, massive deal, Brazil and China, and that would be in real and yuan. So this is happening everywhere now. I mean, if you just check it out, the deals that are being done, they're all in non-dollar currencies. So that is one to watch, all day, every day, because the world is turning. All the money is moving out of European banks because they are freaked that we robbed the Russian money and that their money won't be safe if we have an argument with them. That was a stupid thing to do. And for Minister Coveney to be arguing for that last year was outrageous, I thought. Law and order party indeed.
I think it was just going along with anything that his EU masters were telling him. And just in terms of the significance of what's happening around the world, it seems that the Russians have been in every African country, diplomatically, I mean, over the last few months, right across Asia. They've struck deals everywhere they've gone. And although we were told that the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s was a period in time of decolonization of places like Africa, it looks like that process is really only starting to happen now. Would you
Yes.
agree with me that there's something far more significant about decolonization? I've noticed that countries are rejecting, like for instance, in North Africa, several countries rejecting French involvement in their economies anymore at all, kicking the troops out, the French troops out. We have from Ghana right down to South Africa, not only saying that they're not getting involved, but clearly actually being on the Russian side, not only in the Russian side, but doing big deals with Russia and having military maneuvers and exercises with Russia. On the banking issue, John, I read the other day that there was $389 billion pulled out of US banks in March alone, the biggest pullout in 1 month in the history of recording these things and in the history of American banks. That's a significant thing. And although I've looked at analysis saying it's about inflation, it's about interest rates, the reality is it's about the way they've divided the world with these sanctions. They've divided the world economically and militarily. They're in the process of doing that too. And it seems to be what's happening is a flight of capital from Asia and Africa out of European and American banks.
That's what's happening, and that's what has them freaked out. And I think that's the reason why everybody is listening to Xi now, because they know in future he'll be the guy to talk to about business. I mean, you saw Macron and von der Leyen racing off to Beijing to get in their speak. They'll be well put in their place. They don't realize what they're dealing with. They think they're dealing with some plenipotentiary out in the far distant east, but it's not like that at all. The new power is China. It's here, and we have to respect it. And I do have great hope for it, because it doesn't seek to do trade in any way that's problematic to others. They don't engage with people along the lines of, oh, well, if you trade with me, I don't want you to trade with them. They rule that out. They will not accept that logic at all. Trade is trade, and it's sacrosanct. And politics is something else, and they should be kept out of the matter.
Yeah.
So,
but isn't there a terrible propaganda campaign being run from the United States and certain elements in Europe against China, and in Australia and New Zealand against China at the moment, which, like, I've seen some outrageous propaganda, so just unbelievable kind of stuff. But they seem to be ramping it up. There seems to be elements, Atlanticists within the EU and elements within neocons, I don't know what you'd call them, within the United States government and deep state, that are adamant that they are going to go to war with China no matter what.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, a lot of these guys get their money from big war companies like Raytheon. And guys at the top in particular of both parties will get a lot of money, you know. Then they, with that money, they give money to people who support them, so they get a little clique, all attached to the big war money, and they vote accordingly. And the more they act in the interest, the more money they get. It's a crazy, crazy situation. I don't know how it could possibly be allowed to continue, because you have this situation, I keep repeating it, where the people of the United States do not want war, yet both political parties do. They can't even vote for a non-war party because there is none.
I suppose the personification of that monetary process of creating cliques through military industry money would be Lindsey Graham in the Republican.
Lindsey Graham, absolutely. He's a terrible, terrible man. And Lindsey Graham, and who else? The former Speaker of the Senate, Nancy Pelosi, is another. She has well over 100 million that she didn't get from her wages, you know, and nobody asks questions over there. You know, politician has 100 million in the bank account. Oh, well, fair enough. She must be doing something right. But it's not. It's because she is sucking up to the big war companies and others, you know, like the awful Lindsey Graham.
I think Senator McCain as well, who's passed away a few years ago, he was another one of them. John, just while we're talking about the U.S. Congress and Senate, there was a U.S. Senator, Brakey, recently made a speech in the U.S. Senate and put on the record in the most blatant and the most wonderful, I have to say, way, the origins of this NATO, U.S., Ukraine, Russia war. And he put it on the record, and every word he said was true. I couldn't disagree with one word that this guy said. And it's now on the record in the U.S. Houses of Representatives, which is very, very significant in itself. We'll just have a listen to this and we'll look at this.
It's very important that, because in any situation, you know, I always remember when I was always involved in trade union matters, and I was a trade union activist all my life. But when you're holding a meeting, you know, it's the people who set the boundaries of what the talk should be about. If you don't get people who can think about the boundaries of a situation, and people only act in narrow boundaries, you will get bad outcomes. You need a broad outlook. And when a discussion is happening, people must put their tuppence halfpenny worth in, you know, to say, this is my view, and not leave it to everyone else, because you'll end up drifting off to war without wanting to.
Well, we'll have a look at Senator Brakey and what he had to say in the U.S. Congress, and we'll come back to that topic in a second, John.
Both Presidents Kennedy and Reagan, adamant Cold Warriors both, none would be accused of being friends to the Russians, always maintained open communication with the leaders of Russia to avoid escalation into nuclear conflict. Instead, our present-day leaders refuse diplomacy and push the war forward to the last Ukrainian standing, not for the benefit of the people of Ukraine, but to bleed the Russians dry, as in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. This posture isn't for the Ukrainian people. This isn't for the American people. This is for the empire that now stands in the place of our once proud republic on a mountain of corpses to maintain global hegemony. That's why in 2014, then Vice President Joe Biden oversaw the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. His crime was not signing a trade deal with the European Union. In actuality, he wanted to sign 2 trade deals, with both Russia and the West. But when the EU agreement suddenly prohibited any economic agreement with Russia, Yanukovych says he felt like a bride who showed up for a wedding only to discover a never-before-discussed prenuptial agreement, and he just wasn't in the mood anymore. For that, he was regime changed. And if you doubt Washington, D.C. had anything to do with it, I have a bridge to sell you in Libya. Thanks to leaked phone calls, we know for a fact that the current Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, personally handpicked the leaders of the new government to replace Yanukovych. You can hear the phone call in her own voice as she speaks with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine about who is in and who is out in the new Ukrainian regime to make the whole thing stick. Is this what democracy looks like? I don't think so. And after the coup, the new government, urged on by local neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, and when I say neo-Nazi groups, I don't mean in the parlance that's often thrown around today. I mean actual Adolf Hitler-loving neo-Nazis who welcomed the German invasion during World War II. They urged the government and succeeded in banning the speaking of Russian and launching an ethnic cleansing campaign in the eastern regions of Ukraine. Russia responded, yes, by annexing the Crimean Peninsula to maintain control of the Sevastopol naval base, Russia's only warm water port with access to the Black Sea, which is a sort of Russian Alamo after many died defending it against German invasion in World War II. Whatever we think of that, it is of such strategic and nationalistic importance to the Russians. We better be prepared for nuclear war if we want them to give that up, because they're not going to give that up. But at the same time, he rejected petitions from ethnically Russian people in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, now at the center of the war, who wanted to secede and join Russia. But over the next 8 years, a civil war raged in these separatist regions. Our own government funneled weapons into the conflict. In 2016, I represented Maine on the National Platform Committee of my political party, along with our colleague, Senator Guerin of Penobscot County. At the time, I was shocked to read calls for sending these weapons into this civil war halfway across the world. That's why I opposed that language and fought to strike it from the document, warning that these policies could escalate into a nuclear conflict. And 7 years later, here we are, living under the shadow of it all. These are only some of the most significant provocations: NATO expansion, deposing a democratically elected government, funneling weapons into a civil war on Russia's border. I haven't even mentioned the torn-up nuclear treaties and the years of domestic anti-Russian propaganda pushed onto the American people through an unholy alliance between U.S. intelligence agencies and the corporate press. Do you all remember that report that Vladimir Putin was putting bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan? That story was as false as the reports of Iraqi soldiers ripping Kuwaiti babies from incubators in the lead-up to Desert Storm. Pure war propaganda. It was completely debunked. This disinformation was planted in the media by, quote, anonymous intelligence officials in the lead-up to a major U.S. election. But if you ever read a retraction, you were lucky to find it on page 36 after months of front-page coverage. That's how war propaganda works with the war machine. Lie, rinse, repeat, and never apologize.
That was Senator Brakey from the United States, member of the Republican Party, I understand. And given what is one hell of a speech in the American Houses of Representatives, something that's now permanently put on the record. John, you were saying it's really important to have that put on the record. Have you come across any other US politicians that have been so blatantly open and honest about the origins and the conduct of this war?
Well, you do. You get a few. Occasionally, you might get some on. But the thing is, you have to go on Fox, for example, to get Tucker Carlson, who will have these people on. I mean, he's anti-war. And there are certain things I would vehemently disagree with him, but I will embrace anyone who's anti-war, because that's, once you get the anti-war thing right, then we can talk about everything else. But yeah, there are lots of people, lots of individuals, lots of eminent lecturers and writers who you will see on YouTube if you go on YouTube, and you'll soon pick up who are the good people to listen to. And there are lots of them around. Yeah. Mearsheimer, there are lots of them.
Yeah. I think even Matt Gaetz in the
yes.
US has started to speak up about the
Yeah.
truths around Ukraine. So when Matt Gaetz and others start to do it, it means that the ceiling has been broken and that the truth is getting out at last. And I don't think we should be judging the messenger as much as checking out what is being said. Probably Matt Gaetz might have his own reasons for doing this, but ultimately, and he might be using it simply as a stick to beat the Democrats with. But ultimately, the facts that I've heard him speak on this issue are provable facts, and that's what you and I have known the whole
Yeah.
time. John, over the coming week, before we close up tonight, over the coming week, what should we be looking out for?
She on Ukraine and reaction to what she might say on Ukraine. It'll be very interesting to see what President Macron has to say when he comes back from China as well. That's what I'd be looking for.
I think Macron is going to come back and say he put Xi in his place, when in reality he was going with the begging bowl. And I believe that they've struck a very large deal, possibly for liquefied gas. I'm not sure, but they've struck a very large form of an energy deal with China. And that's ultimately what he was going over for. But I did see a report this morning where he was kind of mouthing off that he was going to put China in its place about Russia, which is absolutely laughable in itself. But he's coming back to a burning France, isn't he? On Thursday, the day even that this program goes out, France is on fire again with major protests.
But did you see the big protest outside the BlackRock headquarters in Paris?
No.
Massive protest. I've just tweeted about it. There's a fantastic little video comes with it. It shows you the place on fire. It's extraordinary.
We'll
and
try
the
and
fact
get
that they targeted BlackRock. And I only found out a French woman responded to my tweet, and she said BlackRock is centrally involved in looking for an increase in the retirement age.
Okay. And others are blaming the EU and saying Macron has no choice, it's the EU. But the French won't take it lying down. I just
No.
had some conversations with some colleagues today, just on the issue of, they're raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. In Ireland, there's plans to raise it up to 70, so the French won't take it lying down. I also read today that China and France have the lowest retirement ages and the longest retirement periods. So although we criticize China and we've been told that China treats its workers in a terrible way, it would appear that they retire a lot earlier than we do.
Very good. Well, it being a socialist country, a communist country, I mean, its first thought is for the masses, and the rest comes next, which they have done, brought 300 million people out of poverty in the past few years. They're going leaps and bounds in improving the lot of their people, and it's great to see. I'd love to see us do that in the West, where all this money could be done for housing in Ireland, for example. The money that we're spending, it could be done we could be putting it there rather than wasted on a war in which we have no interest, yet we are being dragged into, and it'll cost us terribly.
On that note, thanks for joining us again today, John. You can get this program on a plethora of platforms, from Twitter to Facebook to YouTube to Spotify to our own website, mcompassmedia.com, where you'll get daily updates on the news, international and Irish news. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Thanks for joining us again this evening, John.
Thanks, Finbar.